Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. The U.S. and Israel have now kept up strikes on Iran for nearly 2 weeks, and the crisis is beginning to look far more serious than a short-term military confrontation. Tehran has suggested that there could be room for mediation, but at the same time, hardline messaging and military pressure continue side by side. U.S. President Donald Trump is making it clear that, in his view, there is no outcome short of unconditional surrender, while Iran is moving to reinforce its leadership and signal that it will not easily bend. At the same time, concerns are growing over the roles Russia and China might play, the risk of retaliation across the Gulf, and the possibility that this conflict could spill into a much wider regional crisis. Tonight, we examine where the standoff may be heading and what the key turning points could be. For more on this, we connect to Robert Kelly, Professor of International Relations at Busan National University. A big welcome, Professor.
Thank you for having me.
And also joining us is Seung-hoon Baek, researcher at the Institute of Middle East Studies. Good to see you, Dr. Baek.
Yeah, it's great to be back within the frame. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, too. Now, let's begin our discussion right away. First with Professor Kelly. So, like I've said, the U.S. and Israel have now been carrying out strikes on Iran for about 10 days. How do you read into the current situation at this point?
Well, I don't think there's too much debate that there's been tactical and operational success. I'm not really sure that anyone thought the Iranians would be able to stand up to a sustained assault by the United States. The United States has been practicing air power going all the way back to World War II, right? We have a lot of air power here in Korea, right? Enemy air defense was suppressed fairly early, I think earlier than many people had expected. But the real question is sort of now that we have this sort of operational dominance, we can sort of strike almost anywhere we want, right? What's the point? And I think this is really where the Trump administration has been revealed to have not planned this conflict particularly well, right? I mean, there's the commentary is just really sort of overwhelming to this point, right? That we don't really know what the exit strategy is, that Donald Trump doesn't really know what the goals are. He's not really able to articulate it. You mentioned unconditional surrender. He said that, but he's also said like 3 or 4 other things. And so it's just not really clear how this is going to end. I mean, we're blowing up a lot of stuff in Iran to the extent that Iran is an anti-American state or whatever. It's a troublesome state. I mean, I suppose it's a win for the United States. I suppose it's better than it was 2 weeks ago, but there's no real clear goal toward which we're marching or moving. And the longer this drags on, I think the more and more that's going to become a real problem. U.S. allies like South Korea, the Europeans are going to ask, what are we doing? The U.S. public is going to say, why are we doing this, right? We already know that U.S. public opinion support for this war is pretty low. It's only like 35%. So, I think fairly clearly the president's got to get out there probably and give a big speech in which he lays out, here are the goals, here's what we're going for, and here's how this thing is going to end. If he doesn't do that, I mean, I don't know, it becomes like Iraq. It just kind of goes on and on and on, I suppose.
Right. So many are hoping for the situation and not to continue on and on for a longer period of time. But when it comes to the diplomatic track, on the 6th, Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian said for the first time that mediation efforts were underway to end the war. Dr. Peck, what do you think was behind that comment?
I think that comment was less a sign of surrender than a signal that Tehran wanted to open a controlled off-ramp without appearing weak. So Pezeshkian did not say Iran was ready to accept Washington's term. Instead, he said mediation should also address those who started or escalated the conflict, which means Tehran was trying to shape the narrative and avoid the image of capitulation. So at the same time, Iran's temporary leadership appears to have discussed suspending strikes on neighboring states unless attacks came from their territory. So the message was also aimed at reassuring Gulf states and preventing a broader anti-Iran coalition from solidifying. So in short, it was a diplomatic filler, but from a defensive and highly conditioned position, not from a position of reconciliation.
And shortly in response to that, President Trump had made it clear that, in his view, the only possible deal with Iran is what he calls unconditional surrender. Professor Kelly, what exactly does that mean in practical terms?
Yeah, that's a huge question. I mean, it's worth pointing out, I think everybody probably remembers this. The last time the United States pursued unconditional surrender, right, it led to nuclear use against the Japanese and the Allies marching all the way into Berlin and, killing millions of people. I mean, my God, I hope that's not what we're talking about. I mean, I really hope that the president can articulate something a little bit less dramatic, a little less apocalyptic than unconditional surrender. I mean, if you tell your enemy that, they have to just give up everything, then, I mean, they're going to fight, right, to the end, right? I mean, at some point, you got to give them something, right? If you just say they have to give up every single thing, then there's no incentive for the Iranians to bargain and negotiate with us at all. They'll just fight to the very last man, right? And that's sort of famously what Hitler said, right? We just have to fight to the last bullet. And that's obviously not what we want to do here, right? I mean, our goal is not to sort of level Iran. And, the president is, he's not really given us too much to go on, right? That term, explicitly that term unconditional surrender, at least for Americans, that's going to sound an awful lot like World War II, right? I mean, because that's the last time the United States really used that. We didn't use that kind of language in Korea or Vietnam or Iraq, America's other various conflicts in the last 60 years. So, I mean, that's purposely hearkening back to, the most devastating war the United States ever fought. And so, I just don't know. I mean, is Trump picking this up from TV? He watches a lot of movies. Has he actually thought about this? Again, I just don't know. He's saying it over Twitter, which is not a particularly sort of convincing way to suggest that he's really thought this through, right? I mean, it kind of looks like he shoots these messages out on his phone. We're not really quite sure what to make out of it, and so here we are having these questions. My guess is, to be honest, is that he doesn't actually mean that, right? That it's if Trump can get some kind of deal, to use his language, from whoever takes power in the next month or so, that makes it look like Trump won. That's really important for him, for his voters back home. Then Trump will look for an exit, right? I do not actually think the United States is going to invade on the ground. I don't think we're going to burn Tehran to the ground. I mean, that kind of language, unconditional surrender, that's just so fraught. And my guess is he doesn't actually mean it.
So it could be Trump's way of strategic messaging and dealing with the current situation. But despite that warning from President Trump, Iran has selected Mojtaba Khamenei, the second son of Ali Khamenei, as its new supreme leader. Dr. Beck, give us some background on who he is and what does his selection actually mean?
So Mojtaba Khamenei is not a charismatic mass politician. So he's better understood as a behind-the-scene power broker, a mid-ranking cleric with deep ties to the Revolutionary Guards and the security establishments. So his selection does signal continuity, but I would be careful not to overstate what kind of continuity this is. It does not automatically mean an all-out hardline collapse into a permanent confrontation. Sorry. In fact, precisely because Mojtaba comes from the center of the regime rather than from its margin, he may have more room to maneuver than almost any other candidate. He can reassure the guards and clerical corps, which gives him political cover that a weaker or more openly reformist figure would not have. So that means he is positioned not only to sustain resistance if necessary, but also, if he chooses, to explore tactical de-escalation or indirect bargaining with the immediately looking vulnerable at home. So I would read this election as a choice for the regime coalition under pressure, but not necessarily as a proof that Tehran has locked itself into an irreversible hardline endgame. So paradoxically, because he's so embedded in the system, Mojtaba may be one of the few figures with enough internal legitimacy to shift tactics rather later if the regime decides survival requires flexibility.
So it could signal a slight continuity inside within Iran's leadership. When we take that a step further, President Trump has warned that any future leader of Iran would not last long without his own approval. What are the realistic scenarios from here?
So there are three realistic scenarios. The first is escalation without regime collapse. So Mojtaba consolidates power, the guards rally behind him, and the war continues as a prolonged campaign of strikes, retaliation, and coercive bargaining. The second is controlled de-escalation. Iran keeps a hardline public posture, but quietly explores indirect channel for limited arrangement. For example, around shipping, attacking on neighbors, or nuclear file. And the third, and the most dangerous, is that Israel and possibly the United States decide the new leadership itself is a legitimate target, which would push the conflict into even more riskier phase. So I think the most realistic path is the second scenario, wrapped inside the first. Khamenei wrapped inside the first, continued hardline rhetoric and military pressure in public, but some kind of quiet search for a managed exit in private.
So this leadership question would be a very important factor in the current situation. Then when we broaden this out a little bit, Professor Kelly, U.S. intelligence has raised the possibility that Russia may have provided Iran with location data on U.S. naval vessels and also aircraft. How likely is it that this conflict would grow into a kind of an indirect confrontation between Washington and Moscow?
I think indirect is the best word there. I'm not sure I would go so far, pardon me, to say that it's a war or even a proxy conflict or something like that. But I mean, it's pretty clear that Vladimir Putin opposes the settlement that was imposed on the Soviet Union at the end of the Cold War. It's pretty clear that Vladimir Putin opposes the Western order in Europe, right? The United States, at least before Donald Trump, supported that, right? The United States was broadly sort of behind that settlement that Putin finds so obnoxious and intolerable. So to that extent, I think that's what's driving the Ukraine war. And so to that extent, sort of as a kind of disruptor, as kind of an anti-systemic force, right? Putin is interested in sort of shaking up the Western alliance and willing to support various countries and clients that make difficulty for Western states, right? And of course, that includes North Korea, right? But also Iran. And so it wouldn't surprise me at all if Putin was doing this. It's not too difficult. Russian intelligence assets are already in place, so it's not actually particularly too difficult to do this, right? The real issue, I think, the big step up, right, if the Russians really want to get involved, would be if they actually began to give the Iranians hardware. That, of course, would be, first of all, would they be using Russian weapons? Second of all, that would be difficult for Russia because they're fighting in Ukraine, right, and they're not doing particularly well. So if they actually started giving weapons to Iran, that would be a pretty significant move on their part to help the Iranians resist the United States. My guess is they won't do that. My guess is you'll see this intelligence sharing. I think the really sort of the awkward political side of it is how are the Americans going to respond to this? We know that Donald Trump really likes Vladimir Putin, and he talks to him all the time. He says how great he is and stuff like that. And it's really awkward for the Trump administration to be confronted with the fact that the Russians are basically helping our opponents, right? And the White House and the Defense Department have been dancing around that for the last couple of days. But if that gets any real traction with the American public, where it looks like Trump and Secretary Hegseth are looking the other way on the Russians helping us, and that could be politically disastrous for the president. So I actually am really curious if this is actually going to get some liftoff in the U.S. media.
So it's also becoming a complex situation for Washington, indeed. Now, there's also the question of China, Professor Kelly. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi called the situation in the Middle East a war that should not happen and urged for a ceasefire. So with Beijing maintaining friendly ties with Tehran, what kind of diplomatic strategy do you think China is likely to pursue here?
Yeah, I think we're all kind of learning that China actually has something of a weak point. Right? I mean, it actually probably shouldn't surprise us too much, right? We've known for a long time that East Asian economies, including South Korea, import a great deal of oil from the Persian Gulf. But the Chinese responded really, really quickly, actually, and evinced some pain publicly, right? This shouldn't have happened. And that tells us, I think that the Chinese don't have the strategic petroleum reserve that we thought they did, that the Chinese are more susceptible to an oil cutoff from the Gulf. I would imagine the Chinese are going to be working on this a lot. They're going to be looking at pipelines over land and stuff like that. They'll be looking at alternative sources. But I think we've actually sort of found that the Chinese are a little bit more sensitive to oil imports than we had anticipated. More broadly, I think what the Chinese are probably worried about is that the Americans under Donald Trump are kind of picking off these smaller members of the axis of resistance or something like that, right? So the Americans are going after Venezuela, now they're going after Iran. It's pretty clear that Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, wants to go after Cuba, right? Donald Trump doesn't really care about liberal order or norms or rules or anything like that, right? If Trump sees sort of a rogue state he doesn't like, even if he sees Denmark, right, he doesn't like, it seems like he wants to go after them. So if you're China and you're kind of propping these guys up, right, and the Chinese have been sort of sending aid and whatnot to various countries that make trouble for the U.S., Trump is actually kind of turning out to be a real hassle. And so if I were the Chinese, I'd be a little bit worried that Trump might actually bring that strategy to East Asia.
So China may try to balance its ties while avoiding deeper involvement. Now, back to the region itself, the Iranian president apologized for attacks on neighboring Middle Eastern countries and indicated a willingness to stop. But since then, hardline rhetoric and further attacks have continued. So with Gulf states now warning of retaliation, Dr. Beck, how real is the risk of a wider regional war? And also, what do you see as Iran's strategic intention?
The risk is real because once Gulf states begin to feel that they themselves, not just U.S. forces, are under repeated attack, the political threshold for retaliation drops sharply. So Saudi Arabia has already warned Iran against further attacks and signaled that a retaliation is possible. What I see in Iran's behavior is a dual-track strategy. On one hand, Pezeshkian's apologies and talk of restraint suggest that the part of their leadership wants to avoid turning the Gulf monarchies into full combatants. So on the other hand, continued attacks and hardline messaging show that the security establishment still want to raise the cost of the war for Washington and its partner. So Iran's strategic intent seemed to be to regionalize the pressure without necessarily triggering a fully uncontrolled regional war. But that is a very unstable balance, and it could break quickly. So I think it is one of the concerns which I see what is happening now.
But when we look at the timeline ahead, Washington, the White House had earlier said that this operation could achieve its goals within 4 to 6 weeks. But Dr. Beck, how likely is it really that this crisis could really be wrapped up quickly? And what's the single biggest variable as of this moment?
So I would be cautious about the 4 to 6 week timeline. I mean, a military campaign can degrade capabilities quickly, but translating that into a political end state is much harder. So especially now that Iran has chosen Mustafa Khamenei, which likely closes off any easy path to a rapid political settlement. So I do not think this can be wrapped up quickly in any durable sense. It may become less intense at points, but that is different from being resolved. So the single biggest variable now is not simply battlefield attrition. It is whether Washington and Jerusalem defines what are the success in limited terms, weakening Iran's capabilities, or in maximalist terms like reshaping the regime itself. So if the objective stays limited, an off-ramp is still conceivable. But if it expands, the war becomes much harder to end.
Right, so it's a quite uncertain situation and it's quite complex right now. But before we conclude our discussion, let's also touch upon Korea, Professor Kelly. There are signs that some U.S. forces Korea Patriot batteries have been moved to Osan Air Base in Pyeongtaek, and some observers believe this could be a preemptive step before sending those assets into the Middle East. So if that happens, is there a risk of creating a gap in the Korean Peninsula's missile defense system?
Well, to the extent that they're moved out rapidly, yes, there's a possibility of a brief gap. But I would just point out, and many others have said this too, right, that South Korea's got a really good defense industry, right? Korean air and missile defense is part of the three-axis system, and people have been talking about that for 20 years. To be honest, it's actually kind of overdue for the South Koreans to have much better domestically, indigenously produced missile defense, right? If this kind of ultimately pushes the Koreans over the line, so much the better. My own sense is that this is sort of the larger issue that this is reflective of is that Western militaries, modern militaries, are using far more interceptors to shoot down incoming missiles than people had anticipated. This is something we're going to all have to learn from the Ukrainians, I think, in the next few years. South Korea is probably going to have to learn that too, right? Using Patriot missiles to shoot down drones is unbelievably expensive, right? The cost ratio there is absurd. And so we're all going to have to start looking around to find much cheaper air defense. I would say that South Korea has a window of opportunity here, again, because the South Korean defense industry is so good. I wouldn't actually be worried that North Korea would sort of like look to use some kind of window to strike or something like that. I don't actually think that the North Koreans are going to see this as some kind of grand opportunity, or China. So if there is any kind of slippage, my sense is that it'll be short. And arguably, honestly, I mean, it's South Korea's country, right? I mean, South Koreans should be spending more on defense to fill in any of those gaps, right? I mean, ultimately, the United States has sort of obligations and interests all over the world, whereas South Korea's immediate homeland defense should probably be primarily South Korea's responsibility.
So not really a very concerning situation for Korea right now, but clearly it's this crisis is having implications for beyond the Middle East, and we will definitely be watching closely on how it will develop. But as for now, we'll have to leave our discussion right here. Thank you so much for your insights, Professor Kelly.
Thank you for having me.
And of course, Dr. Beck, we appreciate it.
Likewise, thank you.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.